Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Welcome to this episode of The Murder Part. Tonight we'll be taking a look at Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer. I'm here with Jeff and Mike. Hi, Jeff.
Hey.
How you doing?
How you doing?
How's it going?
So, initial thoughts before we get into the background of Gary Ridgway. What were your impressions just as you look at this case? An incredible serial killer. Of course, I'm not complimenting him, but in the world of serial killers, he really stood out.
Yeah.
Tough to learn about. I mean, tough to read some of this stuff.
Yeah, devastating killer.
Yeah. Very much so. And just so cold. Just like people call him a monster and he just accepted it. You know,
Right. No apologies.
no apologies, no nothing. Just like when you if you watch some of the interviews, because they recorded many of the interviews after he was caught, and like people's like they ask him like, people call you a monster. He's like, yep, they call me a monster. It's like no reaction to that. I'm sorry, if somebody called me a monster, I might be a little upset by that.
Oh, yeah.
No, he has a certain pride in the work he's done. Now, the last I checked, Gary Ridgway is actually still alive.
Yeah.
In prison.
Mm-hmm.
In the state of Washington, I believe.
Yeah, he had been moved to a federal institution outside of Washington.
Oh, okay.
But was moved back because they wanted him to be more accessible in case they found any future remains.
Yeah, he was prolific. I think Sam Little is the only serial killer in the United States who killed more people than Gary Ridgway.
I don't know. H.H. Holmes might have them both beat, but we don't know. We don't have enough accurate records from the time, but H.H. Holmes himself claimed it was over 100.
Right, so the modern serial
Let's get to
killers.
the modern serial killers, because H.H. Holmes was a fascinating case. I love talking about him, but yeah, we have much more information that's verifiable about Gary Ridgway.
Yeah, so Gary Ridgway, he was born in February of 1949, and his family moved to King County, Washington, when he was 11 years old. Right, so he's introduced into Washington. Now, his relationship with his mother, I mean, I know that's kind of seems overplayed in the world of mental health, but I think it is a critical relationship, and he had a very strange relationship with his mother that really, really stood out, even among serial killers who typically have unusual relationships with their mother.
Right. I mean, it's the old school Freudian psychoanalysis therapists who tend to be the ones who say, so tell me about your mother. But in this case, like, it actually really had a big impact on his upbringing. She was incredibly strict. He didn't have a great relationship with her. One of the things that really struck me was when he was in his early teens, like 12, 13, 14 years old, he had a problem with wetting the bed. And she would take and like wash his, not just his sheets, but she would wash his body by hand and punish him for doing that after washing his genitals. And it really started to, at that age, build a conflicting relationship in his mind. Like he was really finding arousal there, but also that was when he first started fantasizing about stabbing her.
Right, yeah, so he was having some strong feelings. And I think the reason that the sexual component is so important is because serial killers really, for the most part, kill based on sexual domination motivations. Now, there are exceptions, like people in the mafia that kill for money and things like that, but mostly it's about domination. And the theory, of course, is that the relationship with the mother goes sideways at some point, and the boundaries start to get easy to cross, and the individual doesn't know how to form a positive relationship with a woman in any way, romantic or otherwise. So they're always awkward, and they end up with a very pronounced drive that expresses in a violent way. Now, the mother was both dominant and aggressive. The father was very submissive. So, we see the story where she broke plates over his head, and he didn't react. Mm-hmm. And usually, if you're getting hit with a plate, you would.
Yeah. His father also was apparently very religious, and instilled that into Gary. And one of the interesting things I thought was that what his father would, when he was had Gary out in the city, from time to time, he would see prostitutes or women in the street, and he would say, he would really rail against them. Like he'd go off on about them. He wouldn't like scream and yell at these women on the streets, but he would talk to his sons about how awful those people were. Like they're terrible, awful sinners.
Which becomes important later on.
It does become very important later on with him.
So his father, now a relationship with a mother that's really, again, kind of improper is bad enough in the ideology of serial killers. His father, he wasn't helping either. Right. He introduced Ridgway to the idea of necrophilia, which just seems like a very odd topic to bring up with your son. But so the father worked in a mortuary, and I guess somebody else there engaged in that activity, and the father would come home and tell stories about it to Ridgway. So real boundary problems, like that seems to be the word of the day here in this case.
Yeah, it makes you wonder why this was okay with either parent. You know, how do you get to that point as a parent of I'm gonna violate, you know, my son, and then the dad, of course, kind of violates that as well. Let me tell him about these things, and let me tell him about these sexual acts that somebody's committing on dead bodies. Like, how do you get to that point? You know, and be fascinated to know about the parents as well, because we know about Gary.
Is there a genetic contribution?
Sure. Yeah.
Possibly, but it's more likely to be a very diffuse boundaries in their own family background.
Sure.
Nobody gets a handbook for how to be a parent, and certainly their own upbringing influences their ability to be a parent. But in his early teens, Gary would be at high school. He and his brothers were all athletes. One of his brothers ran track and was a track star. Gary did wrestling. He was on the wrestling team, which actually is a very important point later on in his life, and in what he literally said was his career.
Now, before this, around the same time, like probably a little before this, when he was young, he killed small animals, set fires, and obsessed over true crime. And there's an old theory, I think it's called the McDonalds Triad, right? It's the wedding bed, torturing small animals, and setting fire. So now obsessing over true crime is not part of that, but you mentioned the wedding
we
bed.
do that, so we're
that's okay.
that's okay. Obsessing over true crime, that's America's pastime. It's not baseball anymore. It's true crime.
So the McDonalds Triad is really, it's debated over how important it is. I tend to think it's somewhat important just because in and of themselves, the actions are very deviant, right? Well, not necessarily, not the bedwetting, but the killing of animals and the setting fires, those are crimes by themselves. So if somebody has two of those, that seems to be problematic.
Yeah.
The wetting the bed is not really clear how that connects. That can happen because of stress. So maybe it's a result of that. But it does seem to connect serial killers together. They seem to be bound by the McDonalds Triad. So
it's a tendency in many of them, but it's not necessarily a defining feature. Like in order to be a serial killer, you have to experience these three things, and it's not a defining thing, but it is something that comes up quite often, especially in male sex-driven serial killers.
Yeah, and you think about like setting fires. If you do that and you risk killing people, obviously your empathy is probably pretty low. If you kill animals, empathy is probably pretty low. So that might be the connection with that, and maybe just the enjoyment, like sadism. Yeah, would be part of it. There was a great scene in a movie, Backdraft, some time ago. It was one of my favorite movies about firefighters. There aren't that many movies about firefighters, but it was a great movie where there's a guy in I think it was Donald Sutherland who played the arsonist, and he was coming up for a parole, and the investigator went to try to to disrupt it, and he got him talking about the fire, and he was just fascinated with it, and he kind of went into a little bit of a trance when he talked about the fire, and the parole board was like, but maybe a little exaggerated, but you do see that like with some killers, like in their interviews, talking about the crimes or fire or any of this stuff, it takes them back. I think that's one of the reasons they take objects from victims to relive the crime. So we see that Ridgway confessed to drowning a boy in a lake, and it's believed that actually happened.
Yeah.
So
He also talked about stabbing a 6-year-old boy in the ribs.
And the stories are the same. Gary's story, and that they found that 6-year-old boy. So yeah, definitely some, not only the ones you mentioned, but definitely some problematic behaviors.
yeah, so we see that Ridgway graduated from high school in 1969. He was held back 2 grades, 1969.
Yeah. It is worth noting that while intelligence tests aren't, IQ tests aren't a major thing and shouldn't be considered a definitive test, Gary Ridgway has been repeatedly shown to have a low IQ.
Yeah, which is quite difficult to believe. Right? It might be one of those examples where somebody scores low because of the way the test is designed, or some other aspect of taking the test. But I mean, I think the evidence strongly suggests that Ridgway is actually quite bright. I mean, he figured things out. He functioned well in life,
Yeah.
but he did not do well in school. And if somebody doesn't have a background in the humanities, they tend to suffer on intelligence tests. So that could be part of it as well. You have to really see the score and like where he scored low. But yeah, low 80s that's down there. But you figure a standard deviation is 15. So if he's low 80s, he's
More than that.
he's down more than 1. Yeah. So maybe a really concrete thinker is possible.
Possible.
He graduated. He went to the Navy.
He did. He went into the Navy, was put on a transport boat. Never saw action in Vietnam, but that boat did transport to Vietnam. But most of the stuff he did was in the Philippines, and that's where he first started having experiences with prostitutes, with ladies of the night, so to speak.
Dating, as you would call it.
Yeah, he dated sex workers there.
And
And
it was-
I think this is the next important stage with women for him, right? So he had a bad experience with his mother. I don't know what happened in school and everything, but here we see he's with prostitutes while in the military.
Right. And it was a very common practice in the military and the Navy at the time. I can't speak to its popularity now, but definitely at the time, especially in the Philippines and some of the areas, like it was, as Gary and some others have described it, like the 20 sailors would walk off the boat and there would be 50 women standing there waiting, and they would be paired up as they were coming off the gangplank. Like they'd just be like, here, you get this one and this one and this one and this one. And like that's where he started having those experiences.
Yeah, one could argue that during that time, that for some, not most, and not necessarily a primary reason, but for some people in the Navy, seeing the world was a major. I think that was even their slogan, right? See the world, join the Navy, see the world, something like that. It was a major feature, and prostitution did play a part in why someone may be attracted to that. So if someone had that predisposition, the Navy would be a place where they could find a lot of that.
Yeah.
And the negative event that occurred during this, it was that Gary Ridgway contracted several venereal diseases.
So again, we see now that was his fault, but
Yeah.
again, he's probably connecting that.
He was, and he even stated in one of the interviews that he hated them for that. After that, when he contracted, I believe it was gonorrhea and chlamydia from 2 different sex workers, and he said he hated them after that. He still frequented them, but he came to hate them because of that, and that was very, very important. Only a few years after that.
Now, he was married at this time, too. He was married to his first wife while he was overseas, while he was with these prostitutes. And when he came back, or at some point he found out that his wife had an affair while he was away. And so they were both, seeing other people during that time. And they divorced shortly after he got back.
Yeah, but I think it's worth noting that
she was supposed to be faithful.
He probably didn't think of himself as cheating. He probably thought of himself doing what many people in the Navy, young people in the Navy, were doing at that time.
Right.
So probably the third strike in his mind against women.
Yeah.
The relationship with the mother, and then the STIs, whatever they're called. And then nowadays things change. It used to be STD. I think it's STI now.
VD, STDs, STIs. There's a lot of different.
Yeah, we changed terminology
different
faster
acronyms
than I
for
can
it.
keep up. And then we see that his his wife has an affair, and then he comes back to King County, Washington, and she's like, I'm leaving. So
Yeah. And I think that it was during that time of divorce, and they had a son at that point.
That was with his second wife.
Was that with his second wife? I was
right, yeah, he marries again in '73.
Yeah, he did. So yeah, they got a divorce. He marries again, has a child with his second wife.
Before he got married again, that's when he starts his job as a truck painter, which he will keep up until
which makes him just that makes him one of the most unusual serial killers ever. 30 years and many awards for being a good employee. He painted large trucks like tractors.
It was at Kenworth.
Right, the Kenworth factory.
He was working in the Kenworth factory as a painter. He was seen as a really good worker. A couple of people that worked with him saw him as like their best work friend. Like they really got along. Like they didn't see him much outside of work, but they got along really well at work. Stable job, stable, easy job.
Yeah. Apparently he liked working. He liked painting trucks. He didn't mind working. A lot of serial killers kind of have a sense of entitlement where like they steal from victims just to get the extra cash. They commit other crimes. Ridgway really didn't commit many other crimes outside of homicide. He looked, if you take out the homicide, he seemed like a normal person in that way, in terms of his employment. So we see that his second wife was not a fan. Mentioned that Ridgway was interested in bondage and liked having sex outdoors.
He liked to sneak up on her in the woods, and
yes, he took pride if he was quiet doing it.
Right, and I think he even strangled her at some point. Obviously, she didn't die, but
with his forearm and his upper arm, which became his signature move.
So we see some patterns here emerging.
And all three of his wives said that he had an insatiable sexual appetite, and he would want it all the time.
Yeah, that is something we see with other killers, although most serial killers aren't married, but many had some type of relationship before they killed. So yeah, it's very common for that type of aggression to be in that relationship. Ridgway did that, and he perfected or worked on his choking style, which he probably originally learned in wrestling. I think it's a banned move there, but he still would have learned it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, in the late 60s, yeah, I definitely would have learned. Definitely would have learned it. It's definitely banned now.
Right.
But very, very likely would have learned it in high school.
Mostly because of the murder part. Yeah.
Shameless plug, but the murder part. That's why they call it that.
So they would get divorced in 1982.
Yeah.
She took custody of their son, but the son, he would sometimes be in the vehicle when Ridgway would go to solicit prostitutes or go be with them or murder them for that matter. He'd be sleeping or waiting or something, and I mean that's horrifying. Like to think about that.
It was during that time period, but shortly after the divorce, when he was struggling with seeing his son very intermittently, that he committed his first murder.
Right. So let's move to the timeline of the crimes here. So we see at this point, he contemplated killing his wife because he had to pay child support. He didn't kill her. He bought a house in King County. He had some renters. He lived there alone until 1985. He would move twice before he was arrested in 2001, which was later in the narrative. And he was engaged to a woman. She broke up with him, so another, something he can blame on women. And then he met the woman who would become his third wife in 1985. So let's take a look at what an outside observer would have noticed in the community where Ridgway was living. We go to July 15, 1982. All right, so just a few years before where his timeline kind of ends. The body of a 16-year-old girl named Wendy Lee Cofield was found in the Green River, and of course this becomes his name, the Green River Killer. August 13 to 15, 4 more bodies are discovered in or around the Green River. The police know right away they have a serial killer. So at this point, we see significant resources being dedicated to finding him. It becomes more significant later on. in 1983, it was in April 30, 1983, when the police first became aware that Ridgway even existed. Mm-hmm. So for quite some time, nothing. Mm-hmm. And we see the boyfriend of a missing woman.
I mean, he was arrested for soliciting prostitution at some point.
Yeah, I know he was later on. Was it also earlier?
Yeah, it was like there were a couple of those where he was arrested for this. And one of the big things, like he came onto the radar, but they kind of looked at him and said, "There's no way," kind of dismissed him. And it wasn't until a little bit later when alarm bells started going off for them when people started talking about seeing a maroon truck, right. and Ridgway owned a maroon truck. So like they really kind of started putting things together then.
Right. We see that the boyfriend of one of the missing women, Marie Malvar, watched her get into a dark colored pickup, and it looked like the driver was arguing with her, and it became concerning. He followed them, and then Ridgway, we know now it was Ridgway, probably, he lost him. Mm-hmm. So the boyfriend never saw Marie again. And less than a week later, we see the boyfriend was with his father, Marie's father and brother, and they spotted the same truck where they had lost contact with it before. Right? So they followed the truck to Ridgway's house and called the police.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Ridgway was able to avoid arrest. There just wasn't enough at that point.
It was a pattern that we saw with him that he would be honest with them, and say, yeah, I did solicit her as a prostitute, but she started it. Or, I had to do something or whatever, but she started it. And so he would be honest. He would be honest that he saw her, was with her. Obviously not confess to a murder of her, but they were, I guess, okay with his honesty. He didn't send any red flags to them, so they didn't question anything more. And yeah, so that would become kind of a pattern of his that, I'm not seeing any red flags here, so why would I question him more about this? And that was that.
I mean, that would also be a pattern of his behavior that they would find out later on, like almost transparent honesty, which is, again, kind of unusual when it comes to serial killers. We look at a lot of serial killers and they're cagey. They hide things and keep things secret. They really want to keep things to themselves. And at a certain point with Ridgway, it's just like almost pathological truth telling. Mm-hmm. And it's like, he's like, yes, I'll tell you all of these things. No remorse about it, but just, yes, absolutely. This is what happens, but I'll show you everything you want. It strikes me like if they had actually looked at him and said, "Did you kill these women?" He'd probably been like, "Yeah." I don't think it would have occurred to him to lie in that moment, but they didn't think that, and police wouldn't think that would work. I wouldn't think that would work either. Like, I wouldn't just be like, Did you do it?
Yep. What time's lunch?
Right.
He never asked for an attorney either.
No.
Yeah. That didn't send up a red flag perhaps either.
Right. I mean, usually it's a good idea. It's always a good idea to ask for an attorney. But
always.
Ridgway actually made it kind of for a while work by giving up small crimes. Mm-hmm. By saying, "Oh yeah, prostitutes, sure." He knew that the task force wasn't going to pinch him for that small crime.
Right.
Yeah. They viewed him as, okay, you eliminated one more suspect, you did us a favor. So,
but even though they knew he was the last person to see these women alive, and of course that would build up over that. So at some point, it's okay, last person to see this woman alive. All right, then there's the second woman, last person to see her alive. All right, now there's a third, last person to see her alive. There's only so much you can do with that before they're like, I see a pattern here. Hopefully, you would.
Well, I think it's a testament to the dangerous life of sex workers.
Yeah.
Right? This investigation was going on so long that there were a number of people who in the law enforcement who viewed it as a losing task force.
Yes.
Like there were a couple of FBI. There was one specific FBI agent who was, they said, "Hey, you're going to the Green River Task Force," and he's like, "Yes, I can." Kind of in his internally, like, "Yes, I can go. I can do this task force. I can solve this thing." And everyone around him was like, "Are you crazy? They're never going to solve that thing. That's
burning money.
That's a career ender. Like, you don't go on that task force." And he actually was the one who really keyed in on Ridgway and said, "This is the guy. Like, this is the guy. We got to get him." And The only thing he was able to do was get them to get a warrant to search the house. And it was crucial because he said, get everything. Get saliva, get any hairs, get anything you can find in the house. Get a saliva sample from Ridgway, everything. And this is the early 80s, so DNA technology was not a thing that investigators used, but he still wanted that saliva. He still wanted those things. And, they found nothing in the home.
Speaking of the task force, let's go back and look at where they made a mistake, and maybe this is one of the reasons they got this reputation. They burned through money like there's no tomorrow, but they also didn't actually do a good job as investigators. So remember the pickup story, right, with the pickup truck, and they go to his house. The boyfriend didn't have a good description of either the vehicle or Ridgway. Not long after this, another witness described a similar truck abducting, like a person in that truck, abducting a prostitute, and called the police. The information about the prior incident with Marie Malvar was never connected. So this is like just probably a failure to have computers or use computers. Like they had so much information, they didn't know like how to connect it. They didn't realize that you had two reports of the same truck. And there was a taxi driver who they were pretty sure was the Green River Killer. So they had tunnel vision.
Right. They had picked a suspect and we're focusing there. And I believe at one point they got an eyewitness of Ridgway in that abduction. I think they got a person to come down to the station and give a sketch, and the sketch, while it's not 100% like that's Gary Ridgway, like it's very close. Like you can see some of the features just kind of distorted by personal view and things like that, but it's very close. But they didn't connect that either. Like when they became aware of Ridgway, they didn't go, "Wow, this sketch looks a little bit like him."
And another, I think it's just the overload of information, and they didn't know how to organize it. We saw the same thing. There was a Netflix special on the Yorkshire Ripper, a famous case in the UK, and they had the same problem where they had like little index cards with like a clue, like somebody calling something in or whatever, and they had mountains of them. They had to reinforce the floor because they were worried it was going to like punch through into destruction.
What they need is a conspiracy theorist to put tacks up on the wall and yarn, and just they'd have it solved like that.
They would have caught him much earlier. Now, November 20, 1983, number of victims is at 11. By January 16, 1984, the task force goes under new leadership. So it failed. They kind of start over. December 1984. So about a year later, number of victims is up to 42. So Ridgway, very, very active, although some of that's dependent on when they discovered the bodies.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So then we see a very, very valuable clue comes in December of 84. One victim escaped Ridgway and provided information, including the fact that whoever attacked her had a Kenworth Trucking Company ID. So that really narrows it down.
Yeah.
The police know that she's talking about Ridgway. Ridgway said the victim bit him first. So he said the sex worker attacked him. Police believed him. No charges. Now, again, it's not clear. I guess it wasn't clear to them that he was trying to kill her.
I think that she did not pursue charges.
Mm-hmm. You're right. The victim did pursue charges.
Right.
Now, at that point, though, the victim, they can say that, but the state should have picked up that case because it was a serial killer.
Right. If they really had connected it back to the other crimes, they wouldn't have needed her to press any charges. It would have just been like, oh, well, she was the lucky one and got away, but we're still going to nail this guy. But they didn't. Like, it wasn't. I don't think that information went back to the task force that, hey, oh yeah, Gary Ridgway came up with another thing with prostitutes and there was an attack and
yeah. I would imagine that from her perspective, the woman's perspective, she would probably be thinking, well, if I make this a big deal, they're going to know why I was interacting with Gary, and they're maybe going to know kind of what I do to make money. I don't know if I want that kind of attention. So at that point,
I think she was pretty transparent with the police that she was a prostitute.
I
Right,
think
but if
she was generally afraid of Ridgway, I
Yeah.
believe.
But if
think
she
was-
pursued charges, then the court would know that. And
Oh, he has the right to confront his accuser, and it would it'd be public, sure.
Yeah, so maybe she just didn't want that kind of attention, which
she
definitely
probably-
Gary's intention on this. They're an easy target for him because they're not going to make a big deal about it. They would potentially not want a whole bunch of people to know what they do for a living. So that might have been a reason why.
And I think maybe, in that line of work, getting a reputation for running to the police probably doesn't win you many customers.
Sure.
Yeah, no.
Right. So by April, Ridgway slows down, but does not stop. By April of 1987, the victim count's up to 46. So only 4, that's a lot. But for him, it's not a lot over 3 years or 2
Well,
and a half
yeah,
years.
and that was when he was after he married his third wife.
Right.
Judith was her first name. And in one of the interview tapes, he mentions, like, in when he gets married to Judith, and one of the investigators goes very sarcastically, "Oh, the magical Judith," and he goes, "Yeah, she was magical. She kept me from killing people." Like, he like his urge to go out and commit these murders dropped drastically because she loved him. It finally became a relationship with a woman that wasn't contentious, that wasn't aggressive, that was tender and loving, and he enjoyed it. He really did love her, I think, in that point. And so he didn't feel the need to have to go out to do these things. He still did on occasions, and I think that he said they kind of coincided with times when she was out of town, when she was away. If she was away for too long, urge would come up and he'd go out. Mm-hmm. But it trailed off drastically after he married her. I think the majority of the killings happened between the time when he divorced his second wife and when he was married with her. But like you said, there were several others that were killed between 1985 and 1987.
Now, the raid that you talked about before, where they went in, they took DNA, they didn't understand how DNA could be important at that time.
Right.
But looking kind of into the future, it was a good move.
15 years later,
was.
they were able to use it.
Yeah. 15 years later, they're just backlogging and adding DNA into the CODIS, the central database for the federal government of DNA for criminal sources. And somebody said, "Hey, why don't we got saliva in this Green River killing? Why don't we see if there's a match anywhere?" And so they ran the DNA they got from many of the victims, because there was definitely plenty of leftover DNA on the victims, and they ran it against the sample that was known to have been taken from Gary Ridgway, and they got a match.
Yeah, so it's worth noting here that was in 2001. By the end of 1990, the Green River Task Force was essentially not functioning. They had spent over $15 million of taxpayer money with essentially no result, although they did collect the DNA that would be important later. So
I think that's like the only thing they did that was effective.
right, they did one thing.
Did one thing.
It was enough. Although many people died as a result of their clumsiness. The Washington State Crime Lab tested DNA. Ridgway is actually picked up for soliciting an undercover officer in November of 2001, and about 2 weeks later is arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder in the first degree because of the DNA connection.
And the prosecutors just wanted to sit down and talk to him, and they offered him a plea agreement to take the death penalty off the table if he confessed to any further crimes.
Which upset a lot of victims,
And he said sure.
or families of victims.
And the other thing that was in that agreement was that he would automatically plead guilty to any other bodies that they found that could be tied to him, or any confessions he made that they could corroborate. And he then proceeded to sit down and give them taped interviews to the prosecutors and investigators. Hours and hours and hours of taped interviews where he talked about literally every single one of them. And he said that he probably killed about 71 victims over that time period, though only at the time, the task force and the investigators only knew about 42.
Right.
And then they were able to subsequently confirm another 6 or 7.
Right. I think it was in November 2003, he would plead guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. And, of course, no possibility of parole. So that was life in prison, no question about that.
And some of the ones that they ended up not knowing about were because he actually took the bodies up into Oregon, dropped them off there. Some of them were where he was doing a good job of hiding some of the stuff and confusing evidence and things. Like he would pick up trash from like dumpsters, take them to the dump site and just like scatter it around to leave it. He would specifically take things like cigarette butts from ashtrays around and then just drop them, like a whole bunch of them in the same area. And he was actually really smart about it too, because at one point for one of them, he literally got the cigarette butts, all the same brand, from the same one, and put them in a small pile near one of the trees, so that it looked like a person had been standing there just smoking, and dropping the cigarette butts, just to throw the police off. Like that. That again speaks to some of that intelligence. Like his IQ seemed to be really low, but this was where he was having fun with distracting the police and throwing them off.
Yeah, some other items, he would use acid to cover deep scratches. So a lot of commitment there. He would call the person's business manager when he was done murdering them to arrange another date.
Yeah.
So he had one less suspicious item there. You mentioned the cigarette butts. He also would grab airport motel pamphlets and car rental papers and drop them at crime scenes. So they were thinking, oh, it's a traveling salesperson, which would be a good disguise for a serial killer. So that probably, you have very confusing crime scenes with Ridgway.
Yeah.
He used the sheer quantity of murders and the diversity of evidence he planted to just create a nightmare in terms of data.
One of the earlier ones that he started doing that kind of stuff with was he put a sausage in the woman's hand and like fish on her, like in her other hand on the other side. And when they asked about it, they were like, what was the significance of that? He was like, it was trash, and so was she. Like that's how like just callous he was about it. Like, and that was the point. He was like saying, look, she's trash, she's refuse, she's rubbish. And that was how he felt about all of them.
I'm sure there was a lot of irony there too, though, because he took such great pride in where he dumped the bodies and trying to remember it, and would go back to them even after they were dead. And
he didn't like doing that, though. He would say, right. Yeah.
He said he didn't like doing that, but he would also he would engage in the necrophilia himself. He would have sex with the dead bodies, and he said he did that. He didn't like doing it, but he would do it so that he didn't have to go kill another one. Right. Like especially when he was feeling that the police might be getting close, he would revisit that several times.
So there's irony there. He hates hates the prostitutes. He hates the women. Hates women in general, perhaps. Loves sex. All about it. And so there's just it's a confusing thing, and I'm sure not the least of which is him. He's confused himself about what to do, whatever. But he liked it, of course. But there's a lot going on there, and maybe that was the most confusing part for the police too. That he covered it up so well at times, but also just kept doing it or kept revisiting it. There's a lot there.
Yeah, there's a lot with him.
Yeah, if you look through his killing career, we mentioned the forearm.
Which is what he called it. Yeah. He said that killing women was his career. Like the painting trucks was not.
Right.
Like that was a job that he did. His career was killing women.
Yeah, he took some pride in it, especially after he was caught. I mean, he probably did before that, but we see evidence after he was caught. But he used his forearm, right, to choke his victims. That was his MO for a long time.
That was his signature from the beginning.
Right, and if they would resist, he would tell them, stop resisting, he wouldn't kill them. And of course, he would kill them anyway. So I don't know if it was his age or he just didn't work out enough or whatever, but eventually he just wasn't very proficient at actually killing them in the time frame that he had allotted. He was getting scratched more, through the struggle. He had to stand on their neck sometimes to kill them. Like he just physically couldn't manage to suffocate them with his arms. So he started using different rope and other ligature. So we see that change. We also see that he maintains the concern about being caught the entire time. Like, he was careful. This wasn't, he would watch to see them participate in other transactions to make sure they weren't a cop. Right. One time he was aware that he left tire tracks at a dump site. He disposed of the tires, bought all new tires for his truck. So, like, he was not foolish when it comes to planning it out. Like, he knew that he could get caught. He knew what the consequences were. So this kind of speaks to, like, insanity, right? He knew right from wrong.
Yeah.
And he deliberately tried to get away. He wanted everything. He wanted to be able to kill and have his wife and his job and a normal life. So not erratic. Not somebody who just, not a Ted Bundy.
No, it wasn't. It was definitely very methodical. I think it was impulsively driven to do it. Like, when he decided he needed to do it, it was an impulse that would drive him almost to obsession to do it. But everything else about it was planned, not meticulously planned, but he definitely had this idea of, like, I'm going to get away with this. I'm going to cover it up. I'm going to hide myself. I'm going to stay under the radar and make sure that I can do this as long as I possibly can. Yeah,
and he had a very long career. He by his standard, he was quite successful. Now, I mentioned he had the 48 convictions. Sometime later, he would plead guilty to a 49th murder, but again, 71 is the number most closely associated.
Yeah, that's his claim. Like, he specifically says 71. But he hasn't been able to give corroborating evidence for the others. And partially, I think that's because they haven't approached him about them. Like, every one of his actual victims that they put in front of him and gave a picture of, he gave detailed information on. Every single one of them. And then he came up with a handful that he didn't. And I think it's kind of for many of those other ones that are still, if he's actually accurate in 71, then it's out of sight, out of mind. Like, he knows they're there, but he can't recall details about them until somebody puts a picture in front of him. And they're like, oh yeah, I remember that one. And he'd give all the details. Mm-hmm. But it's just so many over such a short period of time. So, I mean, and that's one of the reasons why why he can be considered so successful as a serial killer. And because it really wasn't that long a run. About 5 to 6 years of
his very active time.
And of his most active time, it was just 82 to 85. It was 3 years. Mm-hmm. And about 2 years, maybe 3 years after that, he had a few more. But his most active time was only 3 years. And he still managed to do that. Like he was saying, one or two every week or every other week at one point. Like he was repeatedly doing this over and over again.
I think it's actually pretty likely that Ridgway would have retired at some point. I mean, he was pretty much there when he was caught.
Right.
When he was arrested. So for the murder, not the other things, but for the murder. So it could have been without that DNA. It's could have been an unsolved case.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways Ridgway would have been disappointed because I think he liked some of this process being known.
Yeah, I think it's likely that if he'd gotten to 65 or 70 years old before he was caught, he likely would have sent a letter to the police and said, "My name's Gary Ridgway. I'm the Green River Killer," and then been hoping to be dead before they ever came to him. And he would have probably outlined everything he did. Because I think once he started talking about it, he didn't want to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, like I said, that complete honesty thing. Like if anybody had ever said, "Did you do it?" "Yeah, I did."
Next question.
Like, next question. Like, "What did you do?" Like, "You just asked." "What? Yeah, I did it." So yeah.
I think he said at some point that he was a victim of technology or something like that, with the DNA capability. And there's a big similarity there between him and BTK killer. Dennis
Rader.
Yeah.
Dennis Rader was more a victim of his own hubris, though. Like,
But
Floppy
nonetheless,
disk.
he didn't understand how technology worked.
Yeah,
and it was
he-
evolving.
Yeah.
And, he took advantage of it and thought, it'll be fine, whatever. But obviously it wasn't.
The thing that's so strange about Raider is he didn't even need that flop. It wasn't even part. The floppy disk wasn't even part of the plan. Like, it didn't make a sense to even use it. It was, but clearly he did not want to be caught. Yet, of course, Dennis Rader was.
Yeah.
But yeah. So
without the DNA, he would have been much like the East Area rapist in California, where it just went like forever in a day. Like, he was just captured last year.
the Golden State Killer.
The Golden State Killer,
Yeah.
the East Area rapist. Like,
he evolved through a few names.
He went through a bunch of different things, but he wasn't picked up until like genetic genealogy. Like he was picked up in 2020, and his crimes were in the 1970s. Like, and he then retired.
He did. He slowed down and then retired. Yeah. So I think that would have been Ridgway. I think.
Yeah, if they hadn't gotten that one sample of his saliva during that raid, I don't think they would have caught him.
No.
He'd have retired, and it may have been something like the genetic genealogy that would have caught him, and then he would have been like, "Yep, I did it." I still think it would have had the same outcome at that point. Like, he would have been like, "Yep, I did it. And here's everybody."
If you think about the time where Ridgway was taking the most chances, when he was most active in the early mid '80s, video cameras weren't exceptionally popular. Right? We talked about that in the video about the Rajneeshis and sannyasins, that they seem to have
They had cameras everywhere.
and they were very irregular. Right? Most people in the '80s did not have camcorders.
No, everybody today has a camera on their phone. Like, you can't get away from it. But yeah, in the 1980s, cameras weren't a major thing. Like, it was only like people who had money that had their own cameras or camcorders, and kids who wanted to make home movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now I think Ridgway, if a killer like Ridgway operated in the same area now, you would have businesses, would have footage, like you have traffic cams. People, instead of saying, "Hey, he looks suspicious," they would take their camera. It'd be over.
Yeah.
So he might have been, really at the tail end of when somebody could even do that logistically, what he did. It'd be much, much harder to do that now. All right. So any final thoughts about Ridgway?
He's cold, but the weird thing is if you watch some of the videos, there's a wonderful documentary on Investigation Discovery that was Mind of a Murderer, I think it was called, which shows a lot of the recordings with Ridgway from the investigators. And the weird thing is that he comes off as really polite. He's very soft-spoken, very, very nice. I mean, he even says things like, "I hated the bitches," like, but just with this not deadpan like you might expect from the movies, just like "I hated the bitches." And he's like, "No, I hated them." Like,
matter of fact, almost.
Yeah, it's matter of fact, but very, very calm and collected. And he really did enjoy taking them out to corroborate his kills. Like when he it was kind of like a field trip for him every time they did. Like, he was able to get in the van and he would sit there just looking out the window, half smiling to himself, and, "Oh, you need to pull over here," and go over. And like, they have footage of that. And it's like, that's, I think, one of the most eerie things, is that he's just so pleased with himself about all of this stuff, corroborating these things. One of the female investigators from when they were involved in that was like, she's like, "I could really almost get to like him until I remember that if he had his way, he would strangle and kill me." And
it's remembering the murder part.
right. To me, I think that she was wrong about that, because she wasn't a sex worker. Like, she was not in the profile of the women that he killed. Like, he didn't just pick anybody; they were all the same, in the same profession.
Yeah. And it's worth noting before we close here, too, that even though I think the police did make many mistakes, a lot of times when these sex workers went missing, it would be weeks, months, and sometimes even years before anyone said anything. So just again, another testament to how awful that life is. I mean, you can imagine going missing and a year and a half goes by before somebody reports you missing. Like, it's amazing.
And he had a very, very clear pattern with it, too, that they were all younger. They were all on the younger side, anywhere between 13 and 19 years old. And in fact, there was one person that the task force had thought was one of his victims, but she was 35 years old. When they put the picture in front of him, he said, "Nope, that's not one of mine." And because she was too old. Like, he has very, very clear victim profile.
Right. And if we think about the age that his wife was when she cheated on him, some of the ages he might remember when his mother was mistreating him, like maybe he connected to
how old some of the prostitutes were in the Philippines when he first, contracted those things. Like, it's very clear that that's what he fixated on for his profile. So other women who were older than that or in different professions didn't have to worry about anything from him. But it was still a terrifying thing to be going through at that time, I'm sure.
Yeah, he was a horrible, well, like all killers, he was horrible, but Ridgway was particularly horrible because he was so effective at escaping for so long. And he stayed active, and the sex workers in the area, they continued to work. Right? They would get in the vehicle and ask him if he was the Green River Killer, and he would say no. And they'd be like, okay.
Good enough for me.
And then he would, he lied to them at that point. But for him, I don't think he saw them as human, so he would lie to them. I think anyone else that he saw as human, he would tell the absolute truth to. And interesting, like, he was getting better at hiding his crimes the longer he went on. And at one point, the later victims that they ended up corroborating, they didn't even have any DNA from them. The only way they corroborated it was because they found trace amounts of the same paint used at the Kenworth factory. They found those trace amounts of the paint, and they were like, well, it brings it back to the Kenworth factory. That's where he works. So, must have been him. And that's how they corroborated some of those. But he was getting better and better as he went along, which kind of makes sense. The more you do something, the better you get at it in general.
He was quite an effective killer. And I think there's just so many lessons that he's taught about, like, that you can take away from the case, which we've covered. And I think that's what makes his case valuable to look at. Yeah. Like, not necessarily the sensationalism, but just how effective, how careful he was, and his demeanor with the police, and really all the things that you just don't see with other killers. He was different, and different worked for him. It allowed him to be prolific.
He wasn't like BTK or Zodiac, where he was taunting the police. Like, he was trying to stay under the radar. Mm-hmm. Like, he didn't, it wasn't until he was caught that he kind of started taking pleasure in that side of it. He was trying to stay under the radar. He was trying to live a life. He kept his job for 30 years and made friends. And just lived a life.
Well, you always see these people in the news when somebody kills and they're interviewing the neighbors. And
he's the last person I would respect.
Right? And they're like, I can't believe, Of course, in the case of the Golden State Killer, I think they could believe it a little bit because he was kind of an angry guy. But you could see people with Ridgway, saying, like, I never would have.
I never would have thought. He was such a nice guy.
Not the least of which his wife, who had no idea and just thought...
she had no idea.
And just thought, well, he must just look like somebody that they're interested, or maybe the wrong place at the wrong time, or, whatever. Which is, that's so surprising that somebody wouldn't know, somebody who's married to you wouldn't know. But it also speaks to Ridgway's ability to hide it and to find patterns and to pick up on things and realize how he needs to go about doing it so that he's not going to get caught, so that nobody's going to put up any red flags and suspect him for anything. Yeah.
See, he had a lack of empathy, but he was able to learn what he was supposed to do to fit in. Mm-hmm. He didn't learn it from that ability. He learned it from other places, but he learned it either way. So it was a crude but effective substitute for empathy.
Yeah.
So that's a good place to wrap up. That was the case of Gary Ridgway. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Certainly a unique case. And please put any comments, any thoughts you have about this case in the comments section. We certainly appreciate it. As always, we'll talk to you soon.